The piercing sound of a telephone echoing through the silent house at 2 o'clock in the morning is something that can chill anyone's blood. For Steph Curry, waking abruptly in his bed in the Bay Area, that insistent ring in the middle of the December dawn could only mean one thing: family emergency. Have you ever wondered what kind of news makes a mother call crying in the middle of the night? In that moment, while Steph fumbled in the dark looking for the phone, his heart was already racing, with all the terrible possibilities that the mind can conjure in seconds of panic. "Mom?" Steph answered, his voice hoarse from sleep but immediately alert. From the other side of the line, the unmistakable sound of sobs made his stomach sink. Sonia Curry was crying. Not just crying, but sobbing with an intensity he hadn't heard in years. "Steph," Sonia's voice came broken, loaded with an emotion so intense it seemed physically painful. "Son, I need to tell you something I just discovered. About you." It was possible to perceive that those were not tears of sadness or despair. There was something different in the quality of that crying, something that Steph couldn't completely identify. Robert Kim, a neighbor who had awakened with his own children crying in the room next door, knew exactly how sounds of anguish could pierce through walls in the quiet of dawn. "Mom, are you okay? Did something happen?" Steph asked, now completely awake, his mind racing through all the possibilities. "Is it Dad? Is it Seth? Did someone get hurt?" "No, son," Sonia responded, and there was a quality in her voice that Steph had never heard before. It was pure emotion, unfiltered by years of maternal strength. "Nobody got hurt. I'm crying because I just discovered who you really are." Something that touches deeply is when a mother talks about discovering something new about an adult child. James Wilson, father of 2 adult children who lived on the same street as Sonia, had gone through similar moments. Those rare moments when you realize that the child you raised became someone even more special than you ever imagined. "Mom, you're scaring me," Steph said, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to process the confusing tone of the conversation. "What are you talking about? What did you discover?" "I received a letter tonight," Sonia explained, her voice still trembling with emotion. "A letter from a family I didn't even know existed. A family called Rodriguez." What impresses most is how some words can instantly change the atmosphere of a conversation. Steph felt something changing in his chest. Not fear, but a different apprehension, as if a secret he had carefully guarded was about to be exposed. "The Rodriguez family," Sonia continued, and now there was a mixture of admiration and incredulity in her voice that made Steph hold his breath. "Steph, they wrote me a 12-page letter telling how you changed their lives, how you saved their daughter's life." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Steph realized that his world of silent generosity was about to be revealed. Carlos Mendez, who worked the night shift at a nearby hospital, understood well how certain conversations happen only in the dead of night, when defenses are down and truth finds its way to the surface. "Mom," Steph began, but Sonia interrupted him. "Isabella Rodriguez had leukemia," she said, and now Steph could hear that she was reading directly from the letter. 3 years old. Her family had lost their house, had no health insurance, were about to give up treatment because they couldn't pay. It was impossible not to feel the emotional weight of those words echoing through the telephone line. Anthony Zhang, a social worker who had worked with families in medical crisis, knew well the devastation that a childhood illness could cause in families without resources. "And then," Sonia continued, her voice now loaded with an admiration that made Steph feel simultaneously proud and exposed. An angel appeared in their lives. An angel who paid for all treatments, got them a house, enrolled the older siblings in good schools, and never, ever wanted any public recognition. How many times in life does a mother discover that she raised exactly the kind of person she always dreamed of raising? Sonia was reliving years of maternal teachings, seeing them reflected in the silent actions of her adult son. "Steph," she said, and now there was an urgency in her voice that made him pay total attention. "They told me you asked for only one thing in return. You asked them to pray for you and your family. You didn't want photos. You didn't want interviews. You didn't want recognition. You just wanted prayers. Great things happen when nobody is looking." And in that moment, Sonia Curry was discovering that her son had been doing great things in silence, exactly the way she had taught that true goodness should be practiced. "How did you know about them, son?" Sonia asked, and there was a genuine maternal curiosity in her voice that transcended any judgment. "How did you find this family?" Steph sighed deeply, realizing that the veil of secrecy he had maintained for years was being gently removed by the person who mattered most in his life. Kevin O'Connor, a pastor who had counseled many families about generosity, knew that the deepest moments of family connection often happen when virtuous secrets are finally revealed. "It was during a game in Phoenix," Steph began, his voice now carrying a vulnerability he rarely showed. "I was leaving the hotel and saw a family in the lobby. The little girl was clearly sick, the mother was crying, and I heard the father talking on the phone about not being able to pay for treatment." It was possible to perceive that memory still touched Steph deeply. Daniel Patel, a pediatric oncologist who had witnessed many families facing similar situations, understood how those moments of witnessing others' suffering can catalyze acts of extraordinary compassion. "I simply couldn't leave there without doing something," Steph continued. "So I followed them to the hospital, discovered the situation, and, well, I knew that God had placed that family in my path for a reason." "And Isabella?" Sonia asked, her voice now whispering as if she were receiving news about a miracle. "She's cured, Mom," Steph responded, and there was genuine joy in his voice that made Sonia cry, even more intensely. "Completely cured. The last exam was negative for any trace of leukemia. The doctors say she's officially a survivor." Christopher Lee, a cancer survivor who had gone through similar treatment, knew exactly the emotional weight of that declaration. How is it possible that some words carry so much hope, gratitude, and relief simultaneously? "Steph," Sonia said, and now there was something in her voice that he recognized from his childhood days. It was the tone she used when she was about to teach an important lesson. "Do you have any idea how many people you've touched with this attitude?" "It's not about touching people, Mom," Steph responded, and there was genuine humility in his response that revealed exactly where he had learned his deepest values. "It's about doing what's right when nobody is looking. That's what you taught me." It was impossible not to feel that conversation was touching something much deeper than a simple discovery about charity. Ryan Johnson, a family counselor who had worked with dynamics between parents and adult children, recognized in the interaction between Sonia and Steph a moment of deep maternal validation. "But Steph," Sonia said, and now there was a curiosity in her voice that suggested she was about to discover something even bigger. "The letter from the Rodriguez family. They mentioned other families. They said they knew they weren't the only ones you were helping." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't silence of surprise or shock. It was the silence of someone who realizes that a much bigger secret is about to be revealed. Stephen Rodriguez, a social worker who had coordinated help for needy families, knew that frequently one helped family connects with others, creating networks of gratitude and discovery. "How many families, Steph?" Sonia asked softly, as if she knew that the answer would change her understanding about the son she had raised. "Mom," Steph began, but stopped, clearly struggling with how much truth to reveal. "Son," Sonia said firmly, "I spent 35 years raising you. I deserve to know how many lives you've touched in secret." Great things happen when nobody is looking, and in that moment, while Steph prepared to reveal the true extent of his silent generosity, both knew that that conversation would forever change the way they saw each other, and understood the legacy of values that had been transmitted through generations. There are many families, Mom," Steph finally admitted, and there was a vulnerability in his confession that made Sonia realize she was about to discover that she had raised someone even more special than she ever imagined. But what happened next would change everything forever. "Many families," Sonia repeated, and it was possible to perceive that she was trying to process the magnitude of what her son had just admitted. "Steph, when you say many, you're talking about how many exactly?" The silence that followed was loaded with a different tension. It wasn't discomfort, but the weight of someone who was about to reveal a secret he had kept for years. Have you ever wondered what it's like to carry alone the responsibility of silently transforming dozens of lives? 47 families, Mom," Steph finally admitted, his voice almost a whisper. 47 families in 6 years. The sound that Sonia made wasn't exactly a sigh or a sob. It was something between gratitude and absolute incredulity. Matthew Brown, an accountant who had worked with charitable foundations, knew that 47 families represented not only a significant financial amount, but a level of emotional commitment that few can maintain. 47, Sonia repeated, as if she needed to say the number out loud to believe it. "Steph, that represents millions of dollars. How did you manage to do this without anyone knowing?" "Because you taught me that the left hand shouldn't know what the right hand is doing," Steph responded, and there was a simplicity in his answer that revealed how deeply he had internalized the biblical teachings that his mother had planted in his heart since childhood. Something that touches deeply is when we discover that lessons we taught years ago became the guiding principle of someone's life. Andrew Davis, a minister who had preached about silent generosity for decades, recognized in Steph's attitude the purest application of Christ's teachings about giving in secret. "Tell me about other families," Sonia asked, and there was a maternal urgency in her voice. The urgency of a mother who had just discovered that she knew only a small fraction of her son's goodness. "The Thompson family," Steph began, and his voice carried the familiarity of someone who intimately knew each story. "Marcus Thompson, Iraq veteran, lost both legs in combat. He and his wife, Patricia, had 3 small children and were about to lose their house because government benefits didn't cover the necessary adaptations for his wheelchair. Joshua Miller, who had served in the Army and knew the struggles of veterans returning home, felt a familiar tightness in his chest. How is it possible that men who sacrificed so much for the country still struggle to have basic dignity when they return?" "I learned about the story through a physical therapist from our team," Steph continued. "Marcus was doing rehabilitation at the same center where some of our players get treated. When I heard he was considering giving up physical therapy because he couldn't pay, I knew I had to act." "And what did you do?" Sonia asked, although her voice suggested she already knew the answer would be extraordinary. "I paid for the entire house renovation. equipped it with elevators and support bars, paid off the mortgage, and established an educational fund for the 3 children. Steph responded, as if he were listing items from a shopping list, not describing acts of generosity that would change a family forever. Brian Garcia, an architect specialized in adaptations for disabled people, knew that the type of renovation Steph had financed often costs more than many people earn in entire years. It was possible to perceive the magnitude, not only financial but emotional, of the commitment Steph had assumed. "But Steph," Sonia said, and there was a growing curiosity in her voice, "how did you maintain contact with all these families without the media discovering?" Naturally, this leads us to the elaborate system that Steph had developed to keep his generosity completely private. Paul Martinez, who had worked in public relations for athletes, knew how it was almost impossible to keep any activity of a celebrity completely away from public eyes. "I created an anonymous foundation," Steph explained. "Officially, it's administered by a law office in Portland. All donations go through them. All contacts are made through intermediaries. The families receive help, but never know it comes from me specifically. What impresses most is how some people can create entire systems dedicated to doing good without receiving any credit." Kenneth Jones, a lawyer specialized in charitable organizations, recognized in Steph's strategy a level of sophistication that revealed both planning and genuine humility. "But then, how did the Rodriguez family discover it was you?" Sonia asked. "Because Isabella almost died last week," Steph responded, and his voice became heavier with the emotion of recent memory. "She had a severe allergic reaction to an experimental medication. When the doctors said they needed an even more expensive treatment that wasn't covered by insurance, I broke protocol." Thomas Anderson, a father who had spent nights in hospitals with sick children, understood exactly the type of desperation that can lead someone to break their own rules in the name of saving a child. "I called the hospital directly," Steffi continued. "I told them to do everything necessary, that I would assume all costs personally. That's when Mr. Rodriguez heard a nurse mentioning my name." "And what did he do?" Sonia asked, her voice loaded with expectation. "He found me in the hospital parking lot," Steph said, and there was a tenderness in his voice that revealed how that moment had touched him deeply. "He was crying, trying to kneel on the asphalt to thank me. I had to hold him. I had to tell him it wasn't about gratitude. It was about love." It was impossible not to feel the emotional weight of that encounter. Gregory Taylor, a counselor who had worked with families in medical crisis, knew that those moments of raw gratitude are often more transformative for those who give than for those who receive. "That's when he told me about the other families he had met in support groups," Steph explained. "Families that had received miraculous and anonymous help. He began to connect the dots and discovered that I was behind much more cases than just his." How many times in life do we witness how one good deed connects to another, creating a network of kindness that transcends any individual planning? Nicholas White, who coordinated support groups for families with sick children, had seen how helped families often connect and share their stories. "And that's when he decided to write to you," Sonia said, not as a question, but as someone who was finally understanding the whole story. "He said that Isabella's life had been saved not just once, but 3 times, Steph confirmed, "and that he felt God was telling him to tell you what kind of son you had raised. Great things happen when nobody is looking, but sometimes they become so big that even the most careful secrecy can't contain them forever, especially when they touch hearts that overflow with gratitude." "Steph," Sonia said, And now there was something different in her voice. Not just pride, but a deep curiosity about her son's motivations. "Tell me about the first family you helped. How did it all begin?" "The first was 6 years ago," Steph responded, and it was possible to perceive that that memory was especially significant to him. "During my second year as champion, I was returning from a late practice and saw a family being evicted from their apartment in Oakland. Jonathan Harris, who had worked with housing issues in the Bay Area, knew well the housing crisis that often forced working families to the streets, regardless of their efforts to stay stable. It was a single mother with 2 small children," Steph continued, "Sandra Williams. She had lost her job when the company closed, and even with government benefits, she couldn't pay the increased rent. The children were crying. She was trying to be strong, but I could see she was broken inside." "What did you do?" Sonia asked softly. "I paid 3 months' rent in advance to the landlord, got her a job through a friend who had a cleaning company, and established a fund so she could return to nursing school that she had abandoned," Steph said. "But the most important thing was that I saw how that experience changed not only her life, but mine, too. How is it possible that helping others becomes as addictive as any drug, but in a way that heals instead of destroys?" Samuel Clark, a psychologist who studied the neurological effects of generosity, knew that acts of kindness release the same feel-good chemicals as other pleasurable activities, but with lasting benefits. "That's when I realized," Steph continued, "that all the money I earned, all the fame, all the trophies, none of that meant as much as seeing a mother able to hug her children in a safe home." "And Sandra? How is she now?" Sonia asked. "She graduated nursing school 2 years ago," Steph responded with paternal pride in his voice. "She works at UCSF Children's Hospital. Her children are in college with full scholarships, and she still doesn't know I was the one who helped her." It was impossible not to feel that each story revealed not only Steph's generosity, but also the wisdom with which he had structured his way of helping. Benjamin Lewis, who had coordinated social assistance programs for decades, recognized in Steph's approach a deep understanding about how to create sustainable changes instead of dependency. "Mom," Steph said, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made Sonia pay total attention, "I need to tell you something more. Something about where I learned to do all this." And it was at that moment that Sonia realized she was about to discover not only the extent of her son's generosity, but also the origin of these values that she had planted years ago without even completely realizing the impact they would have. Great things happen when nobody is looking, and sometimes the biggest happen when a mother finally discovers that her silent teachings became the guiding principle of her son's extraordinary life. Nobody could imagine that that moment would be the turning point. "Where you learned to do all this," Sonia repeated slowly, and it was possible to perceive that something was changing in her understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle she didn't know existed were beginning to fit together. "Steph, son, what do you mean by that?" "Mom," Steph said, and there was a tenderness in his voice that carried decades of preserved memories. "Don't you really remember? Don't you remember all those times you would sneak out during Dad's games? Have you ever wondered what it's like to discover that actions you thought were secret were being observed and absorbed by small and impressionable eyes?" The silence that followed was loaded with a revelation that would forever change how Sonia saw her own maternal legacy. "Steph," Sonia whispered, and there was growing incredulity in her voice. "You were watching me?" "Since I was 8 years old, Mom," Steph confirmed, and now his voice carried the accumulated gratitude of decades. "Every time you thought I was watching the game with the other family members, I was following you. I saw you leaving the stadium in the middle of the second half, carrying those bags you prepared at home. It was impossible not to feel that a family secret was being revealed in layers, like petals of a flower opening slowly. Timothy Walker, who had grown up watching his own mother do silent acts of kindness, understood how children absorb much deeper lessons through what they see than what they hear. "Do you remember, Mrs. Patterson?" Steph asked, and there was a specificity in his memory that revealed how deeply those moments had marked him. "The elderly lady who lived in that small apartment near the old stadium in Charlotte?" "Steph, how did you—" Sonia began, but her voice failed when the complete memory began to return. "I saw you take food to her during the entire winter of 1999, Steph continued, his voice now loaded with an admiration that had grown over the years. "Every week, you prepared extra meals, put them in containers, and went to her apartment during games. You never told anyone anything. Something that touches deeply is when we discover that moments we considered insignificant became the most important formative memories of someone we love." David Rodriguez, who had been raised by an equally generous mother, knew how these silent examples often shape a child's character more than any words. "And do you remember the Johnson family?" Steffi asked, and now Sonia could hear that he was reliving specific memories he had kept as treasures. Mr. Johnson had lost his job at the factory, and they had 4 small children. "My God!" Sonia whispered, and it was possible to perceive that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of how her actions had been observed and internalized. "You sold your jewelry, Mom," Steph said, and there was a reverence in his voice that made that memory sound like a prayer. "I saw you take your diamond, earrings, the necklace that Grandma had given you, and take everything to the pawn shop. And then I saw you put the money in an envelope and slip it under the Johnsons' door." Michael Thompson, a jeweler who had worked with many people selling precious items to help others, knew that the type of sacrifice Sonia had made required a level of love that transcended any material attachment. "You thought nobody had seen," Steph continued, "but I was hidden behind that big tree in the backyard. I saw you cry after putting the envelope under the door. Not crying from sadness, but crying because you knew that family could buy food for the children." Naturally, this leads us to the moment that revealed how an 8-year-old child processed that lesson about sacrificial generosity. Marcus Williams, a child psychologist who studied how children internalize moral values, knew that moments like that often become the foundational pillars of adult personality. "It was that night that I understood," Steph said, "that doing good wasn't about receiving thanks or recognition. It was about loving people you didn't even know well, just because they needed love." "Steph, son," Sonia began, but Steph gently interrupted her. "It's not over, Mom," he said. "Do you remember Christmas of 2001? When you said we had to economize that year because Dad's business was going through difficulties?" "Yes," Sonia responded hesitantly, as if she were preparing to discover that another of her secrets had been witnessed. "You didn't economize because the business was bad," Steph said, and there was an understanding in his voice that had been refined by years of reflection. "You economized because there were 12 families in our church who couldn't afford to give presents to their children, and you secretly adopted all of them. What impresses most is how a child can observe and understand sacrifices that not even the adults around them completely perceive." Ashley Williams, who coordinated family adoption programs during holidays, knew that adopting 12 families represented an extraordinary financial and emotional commitment. "I found the list under your mattress," Steph admitted, "with all the names, children's ages, and what each one had asked Santa for. You had circled specific items and calculated exactly how much it would cost to give each child at least 2 presents. Steph, Sonia began, but now her voice was choked with emotions she hadn't visited in 15 decades. And I saw you on Christmas Eve, Steph continued, putting all those wrapped presents in the car trunk at 2 o'clock in the morning. You spent the entire night driving around the city, leaving presents at doors, always with cards signed, "With love, Santa." It was impossible not to feel that that revelation was touching something much deeper than memories. It was revealing how one person's character can be transmitted through silent actions observed by attentive eyes and receptive hearts. "But do you know which moment marked me the most?" Steph asked, and Sonia could feel that he was preparing to share something that had fundamentally shaped his understanding about generosity. "Which moment, son?" Sonia whispered. "It was when I was 10 years old," Steph said, "and you didn't know I was awake. It was a Thursday night, and you were sitting at the kitchen table, counting and recounting the household bills. How many times in life does a mother sacrifice her own needs, without even realizing she's teaching a deep lesson about priorities?" Andrea Hall, a single mother who had gone through similar financial situations, understood exactly the type of careful calculation that mothers make to stretch every dollar. "I saw you separate the money into small piles," Steph continued. "One for rent, one for food, one for gas. And then I saw you take $20, which was our money for pizza on the weekend, and put it in an envelope. The envelope for Mrs. Martinez," Sonia whispered, and it was possible to perceive that the memory was returning with painful clarity. "Mrs. Martinez, whose granddaughter had been diagnosed with diabetes and needed insulin," Steph confirmed. "You sacrificed our family pizza because a child you barely knew needed medication to live." Great things happen when nobody is looking. But sometimes the biggest lessons about humanity are transmitted when a mother thinks she's alone, making choices that define not only her own soul, but also shape the heart of a child who observes in silence. "And do you know what I did the next day?" Steph asked. "What did you do?" Sonia asked, her voice almost inaudible. "I took my piggy bank, that pink pig that Grandma had given me, and broke it," Steph said. "I took all the dollars and coins I had been saving to buy that basketball game and put everything in an envelope. And then I wrote, 'For the family that Mom helped,' and left it in your purse." It was impossible not to feel that that moment represented the complete transmission of values between generations, as if a spiritual torch had been passed from mother to son through a pure act of loving imitation. "It was you," Sonia whispered, and now there were tears of understanding rolling down her face. "All those years, I found extra money in my purse, small amounts I thought I had forgotten there. It was you, putting your child's money to help with donations." "From 10 years old until I left home for college," Steph confirmed. "Every time you helped someone, I helped you help, because you taught me that loving means being willing to give up something you want to give to someone who needs it." Nicole Martinez, a family therapist who had studied how values are transmitted between generations, recognized in Steph and Sonia's story one of the purest examples of moral learning through behavioral modeling she had ever witnessed. "Steph," Sonia said, and now there was a reverence in her voice that made it seem like she was speaking a prayer. "Do you have any idea how many lives you've touched because of this?" "No, Mom," Steph responded. "Do you have any idea how many lives you've touched? Because every family I help, every child who receives medical treatment, every veteran who gets an adapted house, all of this started with you teaching me that true love is a verb, not a noun. How many times in life do we discover that our most important legacy isn't the things we consciously try to teach, but the examples we live when we think nobody is paying attention? Great things happen when nobody is looking. And sometimes the biggest happen when a mother lives her values so completely that they become the moral compass that will guide her son to touch thousands of lives throughout decades of silent generosity. And it was then that the truth finally came to light. "Steph," Sonia said, and there was a quality in her voice he had never heard before. It was maternal pride mixed with a reverence that made it seem like she was talking about something sacred. "I need to tell you the rest of the Rodriguez letter. Have you ever wondered what it's like to discover that the legacy you planted grew far beyond what you ever imagined possible?" In that moment, while Sonia prepared to reveal something that would forever change how Steph saw the impact of his actions, the silence of dawn seemed to carry the weight of decades of love, finally being recognized. "Isabella wants to meet you," Sonia said, and now there were tears of joy in her voice. "She drew a card for you, a card where she drew herself playing basketball, completely cured, with the hair that grew back after chemotherapy." It was possible to perceive that that image had touched Sonia in a way that transcended any description. Kimberly King, an art therapist who had worked with child cancer survivors, knew that when a child draws herself healthy and active, it represents much more than art. It represents materialized hope. "And do you know what she wrote on the card?" Sonia asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "What did she write, Mom?" She wrote, "To the angel that God sent to our family. Thank you for letting me grow up to be like you," Sonia read, and it was possible to hear through the telephone line the sound of paper being handled with reverence. "Steph, a 6-year-old child sees you as an example of who she wants to become. Something that touches deeply is when we discover that our acts of kindness became inspiration for the next generation." Katie Thompson, an early childhood education teacher who had seen how children process traumatic experiences, knew that when a child cancer survivor chooses someone as a role model, it represents deep trust in the future. "But that's not all," Sonia continued, and there was an urgency in her voice that suggested she was about to reveal something even bigger. "The Rodriguez family told me they started connecting with other families who received similar help. Families who were wondering where so much kindness came from. Naturally, this leads us to the moment that revealed how a network of gratitude had formed silently over the years. Lauren Miller, a social worker who had coordinated support groups for families in crisis, knew how often these families connect and share their experiences of healing and hope. "How many families, Mom?" Steph asked, although his voice suggested he was preparing for an answer that would surprise him. 73 families, Steph," Sonia responded, and the weight of that number echoed through the line like a divine revelation. 73 families that connected through one thing in common. They all received miraculous help from an anonymous source that changed their lives forever. How is it possible that one person touches so many lives that they form an entire community of gratitude? Megan Garcia, who had studied social networks of mutual support, recognized in Sonia's description something that went far beyond individual charity. It was the creation of an extended family of hope. "And they want to do something to thank you," Sonia said. "They organized a surprise. A celebration not of you, but of the values you represent. A celebration of silent kindness." "Mom, I can't," Steph began, but Sonia gently interrupted him. "I know you don't want recognition," she said, "but this isn't about recognition, son. It's about something much deeper. It's about showing other people that angels still exist on Earth. What impresses most is how some events transcend any original intention and become catalysts for much bigger changes. Christina Lopez, a community event organizer, knew that when families unite around shared gratitude, the result can be transformative for an entire community. The celebration will be at the hospital where Isabella was treated, Sonia explained. Not a party for you, but a demonstration of how one person living correct values can create waves of kindness that spread far beyond what she would ever imagine. "And will you be there?" Steph asked, and there was a vulnerability in his question that revealed how important it was for him to have his mother witnessing the legacy she had planted. "Son," Sonia said, and now there was a solemnity in her voice that made it seem like she was about to make a prophetic declaration. "I wouldn't miss this for anything in the world, because I need to see with my own eyes what happens when a mother raises a son who understands that true greatness isn't about being known, but about knowing that you made a difference." It was impossible not to feel that that conversation had transcended a simple discovery about charity and become an affirmation about the transformative power of maternal love. Rebecca White, who had studied family dynamics for decades, recognized in the interaction between Sonia and Steph one of the purest examples of values being transmitted and then validated that she had ever witnessed. 1 week later, at UCSF Children's Hospital, something extraordinary happened. Sonia Curry arrived 2 hours before schedule, not out of nervousness, but because she needed to completely absorb that moment that would validate decades of silent maternal teachings. "Mrs. Curry," a small voice said behind her. Sonia turned to see Isabella Rodriguez, a 6-year-old girl with curly brown hair that had grown again, bright eyes full of life, and a smile that radiated the pure joy of someone who had won a battle that many children can't win. "Are you our angel's mommy?" Isabella asked, and there was an innocence in her question that made Sonia realize she was being introduced not as the mother of a celebrity, but as the mother of someone who had saved lives. "Yes, dear," Sonia responded, kneeling to Isabella's eye level, "and you're the brave girl who fought so well." "I wanted to thank you," Isabella said, and now there was a seriousness in her voice that transcended her age for raising a son that God uses to help families like mine. How many times in life does someone receive gratitude not for their own actions, but for having raised someone who makes a difference in the world? Danielle Harris, who had worked with families of child cancer survivors, knew that when a child expresses gratitude this way, she's speaking not only for herself, but for an entire family that was saved. "When I grow up," Isabella continued, "I want to help other children like your son helped me. Mommy said that good people raise good people, and that you must be very good to have raised someone so good." It was impossible not to feel that that 6-year-old child was articulating a truth about family legacy that many adults never completely understand. When Steph finally arrived, he found his mother surrounded by dozens of families, not celebrating him, but celebrating the values she had planted and that were now multiplying through generations. "Thank you," he whispered in Sonia's ear while hugging her, "for teaching me that love is a verb." "Thank you," Sonia responded, "for showing me that a mother can raise a son who changes the world without the world even knowing his name." Great things happen when nobody is looking, but sometimes the biggest happen when a mother finally witnesses that the values she planted in silence became seeds that grew into an entire forest of kindness, touching lives she'll never know, creating changes that will last for generations. That night, When Sonia returned home, she found a pile of letters that had arrived during the day. Letters from families around the country who had heard about the celebration and wanted to share their own stories of anonymous help received. She didn't know if they all came from her son, but she knew one thing for certain. Somewhere in the country, other mothers were raising other children who understood that true greatness isn't about being seen, but about seeing needs and acting out of love. And perhaps that's the most beautiful lesson of all, that when a mother lives her values so completely that they become the moral DNA of her son, she doesn't create just one good person. She creates a multiplier of kindness that will touch thousands of lives she'll never know, proving that the most lasting legacy isn't what we build for ourselves, but what we plant in the hearts of those we love. How is it possible that a crying phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning becomes a celebration of the purest love that exists? The love of a mother who lived so integrally that she created a son capable of changing the world one family at a time, always in silence, always with love, always honoring the values she planted when he was just a child, observing how true angels act when they think nobody is looking.